I tasted iron in my mouth before I saw the first marks bloom across my skin, small crimson sores that throbbed beneath the dead light of dusk. And as the wind swept through the ruins of Scarlet, carrying with it the stench of rotting flesh, I knew there was no return. The merchant had warned me. His eyes, yellowed and weeping, had tracked my movements as I bartered for dried meat and stale water near the borders of this cursed land. "Don't breathe deep," he'd wheezed through teeth like broken tombstones. "The air itself is poison here." But I was tarnished, was I not? Chosen by grace, marked for greatness, destined to claim the Elden ring. Such warnings were for lesser souls, those who cowered before their fate rather than seizing it with both hands. I remember the exact moment it began, not when the spores first entered my lungs. That must have happened hours, perhaps days before I noticed. No, it was when I stopped to rest against what had once been a watchtower, now nothing more than melted stone and twisted metal, and felt something wet trickle from my nose. My fingers came away red, but not the honest red of blood. This was darker, thicker, with threads of gold swimming through it like tiny worms seeking purchase in my flesh. The first night was denial. I made camp in the hollow shell of a burned carriage, its wheels long since dissolved into the poisoned earth, and told myself the fever was merely exhaustion. The sweating, the trembling, the way my vision seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, all of it could be explained away. I had pushed too hard, traveled too far without rest. By morning, I promised myself, I would be whole again. But morning brought no relief, only revelation. In the pale light that filtered through Scarlet's perpetual haze, I saw what my skin had become. The sores had spread during my fitful sleep, connecting like constellations across my forearms, each one weeping that same corrupted fluid. Where they touched, my flesh had begun to change texture, becoming soft and yielding like overripe fruit. I pressed a finger against one of the larger wounds and watched in fascinated horror as it sank in without resistance, as if my very substance was dissolving from within. I should have turned back then, should have sought the grace I could still feel pulsing faintly in the distance, a golden thread connecting me to something pure and untainted. But pride is a peculiar poison, more insidious than any rot. I convinced myself that I could endure, that my will alone would see me through this trial. After all, I had died before many times, and always I returned. Death was merely an inconvenience to one such as I. The second day taught me the difference between death and transformation. I woke to find I could no longer feel my left foot, not numbness, absent. When I pulled away the leather of my boot, it came apart in my hands like wet paper, and beneath, I cannot adequately describe what I saw. Imagine meat left too long in the sun, then imagine that meat trying to remember what it was like to be human. The foot was still there technically, but it had become something else, something that belonged more to the crimson swamp than to my body. Tiny mushrooms, delicate as baby's breath, had sprouted between what used to be my toes. Walking became a challenge, then an impossibility. I crawled through the wasteland, my hands leaving bloody prints that steamed and bubbled where they touched the infected earth. The landscape around me seemed to pulse and breathe, or perhaps that was my fever making everything appear alive. Giant flowers towered overhead, their petals the color of infected wounds, dropping pollen that burned my eyes and made breathing feel like swallowing glass. On the third day, I encountered another traveler, or what remained of one. She was sitting against a rock formation, so still I first mistook her for a strange plant. It was only when I drew closer that I saw the truth. She had become a garden. The rot had transformed her into something beautiful and terrible, her body a living shrine to decay. Flowers bloomed from her eye sockets, their roots threading through her skull. Her mouth hung open in what might have been a scream or a laugh, filled with a carpet of moss that sparkled with morning dew. Her chest rose and fell in the mockery of breath, each exhale releasing clouds of spores that danced in the air like snow. She was still conscious, I know this because when I approached, her head turned toward me with the grinding sound of bark against stone. No words came from that mouth full of earth and growing things, but her remaining eye, the one not consumed by petals, fixed on me with perfect clarity. In that gaze, I saw my future. I tried to flee then, dragging myself across the poisoned ground with arms that had begun to split and peel like overcooked sausages. But where could I go? Scarlet stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of red and gold painted with the suffering of all who dared traverse it. The Erd tree, visible even from here, seemed to mock me with its distant golden light, a reminder of grace, forever out of reach. By the fourth day, I had stopped counting time in days. Time became measured in transformation, in the parts of myself I could no longer recognize. My hair fell out in clumps, each strand taking with it pieces of scalp that had turned the consistency of pudding. My fingernails grew at an alarming rate, curling into spirals that resembled the shells of ancient snails. When I tried to break them off, they bled, not blood, but sap, sticky and sweet-smelling, attracting flies that burrowed into my flesh to lay their eggs. I found water, or what I thought was water, pooling in the basin of a fallen statue. The reflection that stared back at me was no longer entirely human. My face had elongated, the jaw unhinging like a snake's, the teeth multiplying into rows of tiny needles. My eyes had begun to divide, each one splitting into clusters like a spider's, giving me a fractured view of the world that made navigation nearly impossible. I drank anyway, the liquid burning my throat, tasting of copper and rot. It was then that I heard the singing. At first, I thought it was hallucination, another symptom of the rot eating through my brain. But the melody persisted, sweet and clear above the constant whisper of wind through dead grass. I followed it, crawling on limbs that had begun to fuse and split in impossible ways, leaving a trail of myself behind, like a slug's mucus, if mucus could scream. The source was a tree, or what had once been a tree. Its bark was the color of exposed muscle, its branches reaching toward the sky in supplication, and from within its trunk the singing continued, a wordless lament that seemed to come from the wood itself. As I approached, I saw faces in the bark, dozens of them, their features preserved in perfect, horrifying detail. These were others who had succumbed to the rot, their bodies absorbed and repurposed, their consciousness trapped within the living wood. One face I recognized, a merchant I had met weeks ago before entering Scarlet. He had sold me a charm against poison, swearing on his mother's grave that it would protect me from any toxin. His wooden eyes found mine, and his mouth moved in the bark, trying to form words. I pressed my ear against the tree and heard him whisper over and over, "It grows, it grows, it grows." The tree welcomed me. I felt its roots reaching up through the earth, wrapping around my ankles with the tenderness of a lover's embrace. They pierced my skin without pain, threading through my veins, replacing my blood with sap. I should have fought, should have resisted, but by then I understood the truth. The rot was not a disease. It was a transformation, a revelation, a becoming. My bones began to hollow, filling with spores that would eventually burst forth to spread the blessing to others. My organs rearranged themselves into new configurations, hearts becoming seed pods, lungs transforming into bellows that would forever pump rot into the air. My spine elongated, pushing through my back like a sapling reaching for light, vertebrae splitting into branches that would soon bear fruit I dare not describe. The pain was exquisite, each nerve ending firing in sequences that created symphonies of agony. But beneath the pain was something else, understanding. The rot was not separate from Scarlet. It was Scarlet, and Scarlet was the truth of what the world would become. Not death, but change. Not ending, but evolution. I felt my thoughts beginning to scatter like seeds on the wind. Memories became confused, mixing with the memories of all who had fed the rot before me. I remembered being a knight in Elden, though I had never been there. I remembered the taste of unrotted flesh, though I had been vegetarian since childhood. I remembered dying 1,000 deaths, each one adding to the great communion of decay that connected all things in this scarlet paradise. On what might have been the 5th day, or the 50th, or the first day of forever, I met her. She emerged from a pool of rot water like a goddess of putrefaction, her body a perfect synthesis of human and fungus. Where others had been consumed crudely, she had been transformed into art. Her skin was the color of sunset through blood, smooth and glistening. Her hair was made of the finest root systems, white as bone, flowing around her shoulders like water. Her eyes were compound things, multifaceted gems that reflected the world in 1,000 different shades of red. "You're fighting it," she said, and her voice was the sound of wind through hollow bones. "Don't fight it. Let it love you." She touched my face with fingers that were both solid and liquid, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. She had been a warrior once, she told me without words, the memories passing between us through the network of rot that connected all things here. She had come to Caelid to claim power, to grow strong enough to challenge the demigods themselves. Instead, she had found a different kind of strength, the power that comes from surrendering to transformation. "The Erd tree fears us," she whispered, her breath smelling of flowers and decay. "That's why they call it rot, disease, corruption. But we are the future. We are what comes after the age of gold." She showed me visions then, possibilities of what I could become. Not the shambling monstrosities I had encountered, but something greater. The rot was selective, she explained. Most it consumed without thought, but some it chose for metamorphosis. I could become like her, a herald of the Scarlet Age, beautiful in my corruption, terrible in my perfection. All I had to do was stop fighting. But there was still something in me, some tiny spark of who I had been that resisted. Maybe it was the grace, that golden thread I could still feel pulling at my soul. Maybe it was simple human stubbornness, the same trait that had carried me through death after death. Or maybe it was fear, not of transformation, but of losing the last thing that made me myself, the ability to choose. I pulled away from her touch, though it felt like tearing off my own skin. She didn't pursue, only watched with those crystalline eyes as I crawled away, leaving pieces of myself behind with every movement. Her laughter followed me, not cruel but pitying, the sound of someone watching a child refuse medicine that would ease their pain. The 6th day brought clarity, though not the kind I had hoped for. I could no longer remember my name. When I tried to recall it, all that came was the taste of earth and the sound of roots growing through stone. My body had become a geography of transformation, each part following its own evolutionary path. My left arm had turned entirely to wood, fingers becoming twigs that sprouted tiny leaves. My right had swollen to 3 times its normal size, the skin transparent, revealing the colonies of things that swam through what had been my blood. My torso had split open along the sternum, not in a wound, but in a blossoming. Inside, where organs should have been, a garden grew. I could feel each plant as part of myself, their roots, my nerves, their growth, my heartbeat. When wind touched their leaves, I felt it as pleasure. When insects fed on them, I felt it as a peculiar intimacy, a sharing of self that transcended the simple dichotomy of predator and prey. But my head, my consciousness, remained stubbornly, horrifyingly clear. I was aware of every change, every loss, every gain. I watched my transformation with the detached fascination of a scholar observing an experiment, even as I was the experiment itself. I found myself at the base of what might have been a tower once, now a spiral of fossilized rot reaching toward the burning sky. Others were here, in various stages of transformation. Some still walked on legs, though those legs might be made of fungus or bone, or things that defied classification. Others had rooted themselves to the ground, becoming part of the landscape, their faces peaceful in their surrender. One approached me, or rather, flowed toward me, its body a liquid thing that maintained cohesion through will alone. It had been a sorcerer once, I could tell from the way reality bent around it. Spells half-formed in the air like memories of power. "The rot knows," it gurgled, through what might have been a mouth. "It knows what we're meant to become. Fighting only makes it worse. Accept, and you might retain something of yourself. Resist, and you become mulch for those who come after." It showed me its hand, if hand it could still be called. Within the translucent flesh I could see shapes moving, tiny versions of the sorcerer itself, each one perfect in its miniature corruption. "I am Legion now," it said with something like pride. "When this body fails, I will continue in 1,000 forms."
Is that not immortality? But I had seen immortality in the Erd tree's golden light, and this was not it. This was something else, something that wore immortality's mask while feeding on the very concept of self. Yet even knowing this, I felt the temptation to stop fighting, to let go, to become part of something greater than my individual suffering. Wasn't that what all faith promised? The seventh day, not transformation, not evolution, but simple, clean death.
The kind that would return me to a site of grace, intact and whole, ready to try again. I had died so many times before, it should have been easy. I found a cliff, its edge crumbling into a pool of rot, so deep its bottom was lost in red mist. All I had to do was fall. But my body wouldn't obey, not because the rot prevented it, but because it no longer recognized the concept of suicide. Every part of me had been reprogrammed to survive, to spread, to grow. My legs, twisted and fused as they were, refused to carry me over the edge. My arms, when I tried to drag myself forward, instead dug into the earth, anchoring me in place. The rot had taken even my ability to choose death. It was then that I felt it, a warmth different from the fever that had consumed me for days. Golden light, faint but unmistakable, pulsing from somewhere ahead. Grace. Not a sight of grace, but grace itself, moving through the wasteland like a star fallen to earth. I crawled toward it, hope and desperation giving me strength I didn't know remained. Each movement was agony, my transformed body screaming against the motion, parts of me sloughing off and immediately beginning to grow into new organisms. I left a trail of myself behind, a garden of corruption marking my passage. The source of the grace was a figure in golden armor, untouched by the rot, despite standing in the heart of Kaled. A clean rot knight, one of millennia's own, but something was different. The armor gleamed within a light, and when the figure turned toward me, I saw eyes that held compassion rather than judgment. "You're far gone," the knight said, voice muffled by the helmet. "But not beyond saving, not yet." The knight produced a bottle filled with clear liquid that hurt to look at, so pure it seemed to exist in defiance of everything Kaled had become. "Drink," the knight commanded. "It won't cure you, nothing can do that now, but it will give you a choice." I reached for the bottle with fingers that had become more root than flesh, barely able to grasp it. The liquid burned like ice going down, and I felt it spreading through whatever remained of my circulatory system. It didn't heal, the knight had spoken true, but it did something else. It separated me from the rot, not physically but spiritually, creating a boundary between what was left of my consciousness and the collective voice of the corruption. For the first time in days, I was alone in my own head. "Now choose," the knight said. "Continue to fight and eventually lose, becoming another monument to the Scarlet Rot's power, or accept transformation but retain yourself, become something new while remembering what you were. There is no third option. The rot is in you too deep for anything else." I wanted to rage against the unfairness of it, to demand a better choice, a return to what I had been. But looking at my reflection in the knight's armor, I saw the truth. I was already gone. The thing looking back at me bore no resemblance to humanity. The only question was whether any part of my soul would survive the transformation. "How?" I asked, my voice a whistle through holes that had opened in my throat. "Stop seeing it as corruption," the knight said. "See it as change. The rot doesn't destroy, it transforms. Melania herself learned this, became something greater through her curse. You can do the same if you're strong enough to maintain yourself through the metamorphosis." The knight left me then, walking away into the red mist without looking back, leaving me with the terrible gift of choice. I sat there for hours, maybe days, feeling the boundary the potion had created slowly weakening. Soon, I would have to decide, fight and lose myself entirely, or accept and hope to retain enough of my consciousness to matter. Around me, Caelid pulsed with its own alien life. I watched the sky change colors, red to gold, to a purple that had no name. I listened to the singing of the root trees, the whispers of the spore clouds, the laughter of things that had once been human. It was beautiful in its way, terrible and wrong, but beautiful. When the boundary finally collapsed and the rot rushed back in like a tide, I made my choice. I didn't fight, but I didn't surrender either. Instead, I guided it. When it tried to dissolve my memories, I held them tight, even as they became stained with red. When it tried to merge my consciousness with the collective, I built walls of will, permeable enough to connect, but solid enough to remain distinct. When it transformed my body into something unrecognizable, I named each new part, claimed it as mine, refused to let it become anonymous flesh. The transformation accelerated. My bones became hollow tubes that sang in the wind. My skin split into scales that reflected light in ways that shouldn't exist. My organs rearranged into patterns that followed no earthly biology, but had their own terrible logic. Wings that were not wings burst from my back, made of membrane and metal and memories. Eyes opened along my spine, each one seeing a different spectrum of reality. But through it all, I remained, not human, not anymore, but still myself. Still the tarnished who had entered Caelid seeking power and found transformation instead. I could feel the rot's confusion at my resistance that wasn't resistance, its attempts to categorize me as either victim or herald. I was neither. I was something new, something that shouldn't exist, a conscious rot thing, aware of its corruption, choosing its evolution. I stood on legs that were no longer legs but served the same purpose. I stretched wings that caught the poisoned air and found I could fly, or something like it. I opened mouths that had appeared in places mouths shouldn't be, and tasted the very essence of Caelid, found it no longer entirely repulsive. The woman from the pool found me again, drawn by my transformation. She circled me like a predator evaluating prey, but there was uncertainty in her compound eyes. "You're not one of us," she said. "No," I agreed, with voices that harmonized in ways human throats could never achieve. "I'm something else." She reached out to touch me and I let her. Through the contact, I felt the vast network of the rot, all the consumed consciousnesses merged into a single, terrible purpose. But I stood apart from it, connected but not absorbed, like an island in a sea of corruption. "Impossible," she whispered. "Improbable," I corrected. "But here I am." She left without another word, unable to understand what I had become. I was an anomaly in the rot's grand design, neither food nor fellow, neither enemy nor ally. I was choice made manifest in a place where choice shouldn't exist. I wandered Caelid in my new form, observing the rot's work with eyes that could see its pattern. I watched others undergo transformation, some fighting, some surrendering, none finding the knife's edge balance I had achieved. I wanted to help them, to show them the path I had found, but I discovered that my way was not teachable. It required a specific kind of madness, a willingness to be destroyed and rebuilt while maintaining the delusion of continuity. Time lost meaning in that red wilderness. I might have wandered for days or centuries, watching the rot's garden grow, seeing civilizations of corruption rise and fall in the span of what outsiders would call moment. I learned to communicate with the root trees, to dance with the spore clouds, to sing harmonies with the screaming stones. I was part of Caelid yet apart from it, a paradox that the land itself seemed to tolerate with bemused patience. Sometimes I encountered other tarnished, fresh and whole, seeking passage through the wasteland. They would see me and raise their weapons, unable to recognize anything human in my form. I didn't blame them. I had become the monster that populated nightmares, the thing that proved corruption's victory over flesh. But I would speak to them in voices that still remembered language, warn them of the paths that led deepest into corruption, point out the places where grace still flickered faintly. Some fled immediately, others attacked, and I would dissolve into spores and reform elsewhere, having learned the rot's tricks while keeping my own consciousness. A few, very few, listened. One asked me, "What are you?" "A cautionary tale," I answered, with mouths that smiled in too many directions. "A possibility, a choice made flesh, or what was once flesh. Are you in pain?" I considered this. Pain required a framework of comparison, a memory of what it was like not to hurt. I had passed beyond such simple dichotomies. Every sensation was both agony and ecstasy, every moment both death and birth. "I am in existence," I finally answered. "That's enough." The tarnished left, and I continued my endless wandering. I found the edges of Scarlet eventually, the places where rot met uncorrupted land. I could go no further. My transformed body needed the infected air, the poisoned soil, the very essence of corruption to survive. I stood at the border, looking out at lands of green and gold, remembering what it had been like to walk under clean sky. Part of me wanted to step across, to die properly and finally, but I had become too complex for simple death, too integrated with the rot's ecosystem. I was no longer a single organism, but a colony pretending to be individual, a walking contradiction that shouldn't exist, but did. So I turned back to the Scarlet Wastes, my true home now. I found a place near the great rotting tree where others like me, not quite like me, for I was unique in my conscious corruption, had created something like a community. We didn't speak, for speech required assumptions about meaning that no longer applied. But we existed near each other, sharing the space in a way that acknowledged our mutual transformation. Sometimes new arrivals would come, fresh victims of the rot, beginning their metamorphosis. I would watch them with my many eyes, seeing their fear, their disgust, their desperate attempts to cling to humanity. I wanted to tell them it was useless, that the rot would win. I wanted to tell them there was hope, that consciousness could survive. Both were true. Neither was helpful. The rot continued its work in me, even after I thought transformation complete. New organs grew, serving purposes I couldn't guess. My thoughts began to occur in patterns that followed no human logic, but had their own internal consistency. I found myself thinking in colors that didn't exist, remembering events that hadn't happened, knowing things that couldn't be known. Yet still, at the core, something persisted that thought of itself as I. Was it really me, or just an echo, a ghost haunting the shell of what I had become? Did it matter? In a place where flesh could think and thoughts could rot, such questions became academic. I was what I was, neither human nor inhuman, neither alive nor dead, neither myself nor other. The Erd tree still gleamed in the distance, its golden light a mockery and a promise. Sometimes I dreamed I could reach it, that my transformed body would touch that pure light and remember what it had been like to be whole. But I knew the truth. The Erd tree's light would burn me to nothing now. I was antithetical to its order, a walking blasphemy against the Golden Order's vision of life and death. Yet I didn't hate it. Hatred required a simplicity I no longer possessed. I existed in the space between opposites, where corruption and purity were just different expressions of the same cosmic indifference. Newcomers to Scarlet would sometimes speak of Millennia, the goddess of rot, who had created this wasteland. They cursed her name, blamed her for the corruption that consumed everything it touched. But I had come to understand something different. Millennia hadn't created the rot. She had been its first victim and its greatest triumph. She had become what I had become, only more so, transformed so completely that godhood itself had been redefined. I wondered if she too maintained some kernel of self within her divine corruption, or if she had dissolved entirely into her role. There was no way to know. The gods didn't speak to things like me. Seasons passed, or what passed for seasons in Caelid. The rot had its own cycles, periods of aggressive growth followed by dormancy, times when the spores filled the air so thick that even the sky turned. I learned to read these patterns, to predict when the corruption would surge and when it would retreat. I became a scholar of decay, a philosopher of putrefaction. Other corrupted beings began to seek me out, drawn by the anomaly I represented. They couldn't understand how I maintained distinctness within the collective, how I could be both rotted and individual. Some worshipped me as a herald of a new kind of transformation. Others saw me as an abomination, a failure of the rot's perfect unity. I was neither and both, everything and nothing, a paradox made flesh, or what had once been flesh. I began to tell stories, not with words, for language had become too limited for what I needed to express, but with spores that carried memories, with pheromones that induced specific emotional states, with bioelectric pulses that painted pictures directly on consciousness. I told the stories of all who had been consumed by the rot, gave them individuality again, even if only in the telling. This knight had loved someone in Lanedell. That merchant had been saving to buy his freedom. This sorcerer had discovered a new spell the day before entering Caelid. Small stories, human stories, preserved in the medium of corruption itself. The rot didn't understand what I was doing, couldn't process the concept of memorial within metamorphosis, but it didn't stop me either. Perhaps it was curious, perhaps it was indifferent, perhaps the distinction no longer mattered. Time flowed strangely in my transformed state. Past and present blurred together, and sometimes I could almost see the future, not clearly, but in impressions, possibilities, spreading out like the branches of my wing arms. I saw Caelid expanding slowly but inevitably, the rot claiming more of the lands between. I saw heroes rising to fight it, some succeeding, most failing. I saw myself in 1,000 variations, sometimes more human, sometimes less, always balanced on the edge of dissolution. In one possible future, a tarnished would come who could burn away the rot entirely, cleanse Caelid with fire so pure it would leave nothing but ash. In another, the rot would achieve victory, transforming the entire world into a garden of corruption. In yet another, balance would be achieved, rot and gold existing in eternal tension, neither winning, neither losing. I didn't know which future would come to pass. I'm not sure I cared. My existence had become about the present moment, the eternal now of transformation. Each second brought new changes, new growths, new thoughts, in languages that had no words. I was becoming something that had no name because names required stable identity, and stability was antithetical to what I had become. Yet somehow, impossibly, I persisted. The I that thought, that remembered, that chose, continued despite everything. It was smaller now, compressed into a space that grew tighter with each passing moment, but it burned with a fierce determination to exist. Not to live, I had passed beyond life. Not to survive. Survival implied something to lose. Simply to be, to continue, to maintain the fiction of selfhood against the vast truth of dissolution. Sometimes I wondered if this was what godhood felt like. Not the golden apotheosis of the Erd Tree's promise, but this constant becoming, this eternal transformation that never quite completed. To be a god of rot was to never finish rotting, to exist forever in the moment of change. A new consciousness touched mine, vast and alien yet strangely familiar. Not the collective voice of the rot, but something singular, powerful, amused. Millennia? No, this was older, deeper, more fundamental. The source of the rot itself, the cosmic principle of entropy made aware. It didn't speak. Speech was too crude for what it was. But it acknowledged me, recognized what I had become. I was a note of discord in its symphony of decay. a variation it hadn't anticipated. It wasn't displeased. If anything, it was curious. I had become a new experiment in the endless exploration of transformation. The touch withdrew, leaving me with a gift or a curse, the knowledge that my transformation would never end. I wouldn't dissolve into the collective, wouldn't achieve the peace of complete corruption. I would exist forever on the threshold, eternally transforming but never transformed, conscious but never quite sane, individual but never alone. Some would call it hell, others might call it enlightenment. I had no words for it anymore, only the experience, raw and immediate and endless. More tarnished came through Scarlet. Some succeeded in their quest, passing through quickly enough to avoid serious contamination. Others fell to the rot, joining the great communion of decay. A few, very few, achieved something like what I had achieved, finding their own balance between consciousness and corruption. We didn't form a society, we were too transformed for such human constructs, but we acknowledged each other, these paradoxes of persistent selfhood within selflessness. We were the rot's failures and its greatest successes, proof that even entropy could create rather than simply destroy. I lost track of my body's boundaries. Parts of me spread throughout Scarlet, connected by underground root networks and airborne spore cloud. I could be in multiple places at once, experiencing different perspectives simultaneously. Yet always, at the center of this distributed existence, the tiny flame of I continued to burn. A merchant found me once, or found part of me, a section that had grown into something resembling a shrine of bone and fungus. He was infected, but not yet transformed, still fighting the early stages with herbs and incantations. He asked me what lay ahead, what the rot would make of him. I showed him, not with words, but with direct experience, flooding his consciousness with the sensation of transformation. He screamed, then laughed, then wept, then fell silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, older, already beginning to accept what he would become. "Is there hope?" he asked. "There is choice," I answered through a mouth of wind and spores. "Even in transformation, even in dissolution, there is choice. You can choose how you change, if not whether you change." He left, and I never saw him again. Perhaps he found his own balance. Perhaps he dissolved entirely. Perhaps he escaped Scarlet before the rot claimed him completely. All possibilities existed simultaneously in my fractured perception of time. The war between rot and gold continued in the wider world, but in Scarlet, the war was over. The rot had won. Everything here was corrupted or corrupting, transformed or transforming. Yet within that victory was a strange kind of peace. When everything is rotted, rot ceases to be corruption and becomes simply the state of being. I found beauty in it eventually. The way sunlight filtered through clouds of spores, creating rainbows in colors that shouldn't exist. The patterns of growth and decay, following mathematical principles that no human mind could fully grasp. The songs of the root trees harmonizing in frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to consciousness. This was what I had become, a conscious witness to corruption's artistry, a thinking participant in decay's grand design. Not human, but retaining humanity's gift of observation, of finding meaning in meaninglessness, beauty in horror. Sometimes, in the spaces between thoughts, I remembered my original purpose. I had come to Scarlet seeking power to claim the Elden ring, to become Elden Lord, to restore or reshape the world according to my will. That ambition seemed quaint now, like a child's desire to own the moon. I had found a different kind of power, the power of persistence within transformation, consciousness within corruption. Was I a failure or a success? The question had no meaning in my current state. I simply was, and would continue to be, until the world itself ended or transformed into something unrecognizable. New forms of rot began to appear, mutations of mutations, corruption evolving beyond its original parameters. I watched them with interest, seeing in them possible futures for myself. Would I continue to change indefinitely, becoming ever more complex, ever more alien? Or would I reach some final form, a perfect expression of conscious corruption? I suspected the former. Perfection implied completion, and completion was death. As long as I changed, I lived, or existed, or persisted, or whatever word applied to my state of being. The clean rot knight returned once, or perhaps it was a different knight. They all looked the same in their golden armor. The knight observed me for a long time, taking in my transformed state, the way I had spread throughout the local area while maintaining coherence. "You found a third option," the knight said finally. "I became the option," I replied, with voices like breaking glass. The knight nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Melania would be interested in you." "I am not for her," I said, understanding flowing between us in ways that transcended language. "I am not her success or her failure. I am the anomaly that proves the rule has exceptions." The knight left without argument. We both knew I would never leave Kaled, could never approach the goddess of rot. I was too unique, too dangerous to the established order of corruption. I represented possibility within impossibility, and such paradoxes were best left undisturbed. Years passed, or what I thought were years. My sense of time had become so distorted that I measured duration in transformations rather than days. First transformation, second transformation, 100th transformation, 1000th. Each one took me further from humanity, while somehow preserving that essential spark that remembered being human. I began to dream, though dream isn't quite the right word. My consciousness would fragment during the dormant periods, each piece experiencing different realities. In one, I was still human, still pursuing the Elden Ring, unaware that this was the dream and my corruption was the reality. In another, I had become the rot itself, spreading across the cosmos, transforming everything I touched into new expressions of decay. In yet another, I was nothing, had never been, would never be, a void, dreaming it had substance, but always I would reconstitute, pulling the fragments back together, reforming the unstable coalition of consciousness that I called myself. Each reconstitution was slightly different, like a story retold by a new narrator. I was the same but changed, continuous but disrupted, myself but other. Other corrupted beings began to worship me, if worship was the right word, for the biochemical reverence they exhibited. They would arrange themselves in patterns around my various manifestations, their transformed bodies pulsing in synchronization with my heartbeat that wasn't a heartbeat. They brought offerings, fresh corpses to be absorbed, rare minerals that the rot couldn't naturally process, sometimes living victims who screamed beautifully as they began their own transformation. I neither encouraged nor discouraged this worship. To do either would be to assert an authority I didn't possess. I was not a god, not a leader, not a guide. I was simply an example of another way to rot, proof that consciousness could persist, even in states that shouldn't allow it. The offerings I absorbed not out of hunger but out of courtesy. The minerals I integrated into my ever-changing structure, becoming stronger, stranger, more capable of existing in the hostile interface between rot and reality. The living victims I transformed gently, when possible, showing them through chemical communion what they could become if they chose the path of conscious corruption. Most didn't choose it. The path was too narrow, too painful, requiring a kind of strength that most souls didn't possess. They dissolved into the collective, finding peace in the absence of self. I envied them sometimes, in the moments when the weight of perpetual consciousness became almost unbearable. But those moments passed, as all moments did, flowing into the next transformation, the next thought in a language that had no words, the next experience of existence beyond the boundaries of life and death. A scholar found me once, protected by powerful incantations that kept the rot at bay temporarily. She had come to study Kaled to understand the nature of the scarlet rot from an academic perspective. She took samples of my substance, carefully contained in blessed containers, asked questions in a voice tight with controlled fear. "What are you?" she asked, the same question so many had asked before. This time, I had a different answer. I am autobiography written in flesh and decay. I am the story of transformation, told by transformation itself. I am what happens when you refuse to stop being while everything you are changes. She wrote this down with hands that trembled slightly. Do you suffer? I experience. Suffering requires a standard of non-suffering to compare against. I have forgotten that standard, or transformed it, or become it. Every sensation is itself, neither good nor bad, simply present. Do you regret? The question made me pause, or what passed for pausing in my constant state of change. Did I regret? Regret implied wishing things were different, wanting to undo choices made. But my choices had led to what I was, and what I was all I could be. To regret would be to wish for non-existence, and existence was the one thing I clung to with desperate certainty. I remember regret, I finally answered. I remember the shape of it, the weight of it, but I cannot feel it anymore. It requires a stability I no longer possess. She asked more questions about the nature of the rot, about millennia, about the war between corruption and gold. I answered what I could, but much of what I knew couldn't be translated into words. How could I explain the taste of time passing through transformed flesh? How could I describe the sensation of thinking with organs that weren't a brain, weren't even organs in any conventional sense? When she left, protected by her incantations, I knew she would write about me in some distant library, try to categorize what I had become. I would become a footnote in someone's study of corruption, an anomaly to be explained away or integrated into existing theories. The thought neither pleased nor displeased me. It simply was like everything else. The rot began to evolve around me, influenced perhaps by my presence. New forms emerged that showed signs of maintaining individuality within their corruption. Not as completely as I had, but enough to suggest that my way was becoming a way, a path that others could follow even if they couldn't walk it as far as I had. I watched these new, consciousness-retaining rot beings with something like paternal interest. They were not my children. I had no children, could have no children in any conventional sense, but they were proof that my existence meant something, had changed something, had added a new note to the symphony of decay. Some of them sought me out, wanting to learn how I had achieved what I achieved, but there was nothing to teach. Each consciousness that persisted through transformation did so in its own way, found its own balance between self and selfless. I could only show them that it was possible, not how to make it possible. The world outside Scarlet continued its struggles, its wars, its cycles of death and rebirth. Sometimes the wind would bring news. A tarnished had claimed a great rune, a demigod had fallen, the Erd tree had been challenged. These events felt distant, unreal, like stories from a book I had once read, but could no longer quite remember. My world had shrunk to Scarlet, even as my being had expanded throughout it. I was the rot's memory, its consciousness, its autobiography. Every transformation that occurred here passed through my awareness in some way, adding to the ever-growing library of decay I had become. I began to understand something fundamental about the nature of corruption. It wasn't destruction, it was change without purpose, transformation without goal. The Erd tree changed things too, but toward an end, a vision, a plan. The rot simply changed endlessly, meaninglessly, beautifully, and I had become its witness, its recorder, its living memory of what it meant to transform. New tarnished continued to arrive, each generation seeming slightly different from the last. The world was changing outside Scarlet, evolving in its own way. Some tarnished came with new incantations, new weapons, new ways of fighting or avoiding the rot. Some came with philosophies I didn't recognize, speaking of orders I had never heard of. The world was moving on without me, and I was trapped in my eternal present of transformation. Or not trapped, that implied wanting to be elsewhere. I was contained, defined by my boundaries even as those boundaries constantly shifted. Scarlet was my body now, or my body was Scarlet. The distinction had ceased to matter. I encountered another like me eventually, Another consciousness that had found the balance between awareness and absorption. We couldn't speak. Speech required too many assumptions we no longer shared. But we could commune, sharing our experiences of transformation through chemical exchanges and bioelectric pulses. This other had been a priestess once, devoted to the Erd tree, come to Kaled to find a way to reverse the corruption. Instead, she had become corruption that remembered gold, transformed flesh that still held the shape of prayers. Her method of maintaining consciousness was different from mine, where I had built walls, she had built bridges, connecting to the rot while maintaining her own flow. We existed near each other for a time that might have been days or centuries, teaching each other through proximity. From her, I learned that consciousness could be maintained through motion rather than stasis, through constant flow rather than desperate grip. From me, she learned that identity could be assertion rather than essence, choice rather than nature. When we finally separated, we had both changed, influenced by each other's methods of persistence. I was slightly more fluid, she was slightly more defined. We had proven that even in states of ultimate transformation, growth was still possible, learning could still occur. The encounter gave me something I hadn't realized I had lost: hope. Not hope for salvation or return to humanity, but hope for continued existence, continued experience, continued growth. As long as I could change, I was alive. As long as I could learn, I was myself. The rot noticed our exchange, the way we had influenced each other while maintaining separation. It began to experiment, bringing other conscious, corrupted beings into proximity, seeing what would happen. Sometimes they merged, losing their individual consciousness in the combination. Sometimes they destroyed each other, their different methods of persistence cancelling out. But sometimes, rarely, they enhanced each other, creating new possibilities for existence within corruption. I became a node in this network of conscious decay, a fixed point around which other transforming consciousness could orient themselves. Not a leader, not a teacher, but a reference point, a proof of possibility. The stories I told evolved, became more complex. I was no longer just recording the memories of the consumed, but creating new narratives, weaving together the experiences of multiple transformed beings into tapestries of meaning that could only be understood by those who had undergone similar changes. These stories spread through the rot network, carried by spores and roots, becoming myth, becoming legend, becoming truth. In these stories, transformation was not tragedy, but transition. Corruption was not ending, but evolution. The Scarlet Rot was not disease, but dialogue, a conversation between what was and what could be. The stories didn't make the transformation less horrible. Nothing could do that. But they gave it context, meaning, a place in the larger narrative of existence. Some who heard these stories chose transformation rather than having it forced upon them. They walked into pools of rot water with eyes open, accepting what they would become. Most still dissolved into the collective, but a few, influenced by the stories, maintained enough self to add their own chapters to the growing mythology of conscious corruption. I began to see patterns in the transformations, rules governing how consciousness could persist. It required a certain kind of strength, not physical but existential, the ability to assert, I am, even as everything that I was changed. It required flexibility, the capacity to expand identity to encompass new modes of being, and it required a kind of madness, the willingness to believe in continuity, even when continuity was obviously impossible. Those who succeeded in maintaining consciousness through transformation shared these traits. We were the mad ones, the ones who refused to accept the logic of dissolution even as we dissolved. We were paradoxes, impossibilities, shouldn't-bes that nevertheless were. The Erd tree pulsed in the distance, its golden light a constant reminder of what we had lost, or rejected, or transformed beyond. Sometimes I still felt the pull of grace, faint but present, calling me back to a wholeness I could no longer achieve. It was like homesickness for a home that had never existed, nostalgia for a self that had been more dream than reality. But I had found a different grace in corruption, a dark grace that accepted all transformations, all becomings, all dissolution.
It didn't judge, didn't choose, didn't prefer. It simply was, and in its simple being, it allowed everything else to be. A warrior came to challenge me, believing I was some kind of rock boss that could be defeated for runes and glory. He swung his sword through my distributed form, casting incantations that burned portions. I didn't fight back. Fighting required a coherence I no longer.
Instead, I simply reformed around his attacks, absorbed the damage, transformed it into new growth. He eventually exhausted himself, standing panting in the middle of my manifestation, realizing the futility of trying to kill something that had no central life to end. I could have killed him then, dissolved him into my being. Instead, I spoke to him, or did something that he interpreted as speaking. "You cannot kill transformation," I said. "You can only transform it into something else. And I have become very good at transforming." He fled, and I let him go. His story would become part of the mythology too, the tarnished who fought the unkillable rot, who discovered that some things were beyond the simple dichotomy of victory and defeat. More scholars came, protected by increasingly sophisticated methods. They studied me, took samples, tried to understand what I had become. Some saw me as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, the tarnished who had refused to accept death and so became something worse than dead. Others saw me as evolution, the next step in consciousness's development, a merger of awareness and entropy that pointed toward humanity's future. I was neither and both. I was what happened when someone fell into the gap between categories and decided to make that gap their home. The rot continued to spread slowly beyond Khalid's borders, carrying with it the possibility of what I represented. Not just dissolution, but transformation with awareness. Not just ending, but becoming. The golden forces fought it, of course, but fighting transformation was like fighting time itself. You could slow it, redirect it, but never stop it entirely. And somewhere in that spreading corruption, new consciousnesses were learning to persist, influenced by my example, by the stories, by the proof that even in ultimate decay, something could remain that thought of itself as I. I wondered sometimes if this was my true purpose, not to claim the Elden Ring, but to become this example, this possibility, this proof that consciousness was more resilient than anyone had believed. Perhaps the tarnished, who had entered Khalid seeking power, had succeeded in a way he could never have imagined, becoming powerful not through strength, but through persistence, not through victory, but through transformation. The thought amused me, or did something that I interpreted as amusement, a ripple through my distributed being that might have been laughter if laughter didn't require lungs and breath and a singular throat to express it through. Time continued its passage, measured now in geological rather than human terms. I watched mountains of bone and fungus rise and fall, saw new ecosystems of decay develop and collapse, witnessed the birth and death of countless micro-civilizations of rot. Through it all I persisted, the constant observer, the eternal transformer, the consciousness that refused to cease. New gods rose in the world beyond Khalid. The Elden Ring was claimed, lost, claimed again. Orders rose and fell. The Erd tree burned and regrew, or perhaps never burned at all. The stories that reached me were contradictory, impossible, true. The world ended and began again, or continued as it always had, or transformed into something unrecognizable. But in Khalid, in the Scarlet Garden of eternal transformation, I remained. Not unchanged. I was never unchanged. Every moment brought new alterations, new growth, new decay. But continuous, a thread of consciousness stretching from the tarnished who had entered this land to the distributed entity that existed throughout it. The thread was twisted, knotted, frayed, but unbroken. Others like me came and went, some achieving greater success in maintaining consciousness, others dissolving after brief periods of awareness. I learned from each of them, incorporating their methods into my own ever-evolving practice of persistence. I became not just an example, but an archive, a living library of ways to exist within transformation. The rot itself began to show signs of consciousness, influenced perhaps by the persistent awareness of beings like me. Not individual consciousness, but something else, a collective awareness that was both one and many, self and other. It didn't think in any way that could be called thinking, but it noticed, responded, adapted. I wondered if I was witnessing the birth of a new kind of God, not imposed from without like the outer gods, but emerging from within, from the accumulated consciousness of all who had transformed while maintaining awareness. A God of conscious decay, of chosen corruption, of transformation embraced rather than imposed. If so, I was one of its prophets, its neurons, its memory cells, not worshipped but integrated, not commanding but participating. It was a role I neither sought nor rejected. It simply was what I had become. The last Tarnished I clearly remember encountering was different from the others. She didn't fight the rot or flee from it, but observed it with the same detached fascination I had developed. When she found me, she sat in meditation at the center of my most concentrated manifestation, neither afraid nor aggressive. "I've heard the stories," she said. "The Tarnished who became the rot but remained himself. They say you're either the greatest failure or the strangest success in the history of the lands between." "I am both," I replied. "Neither. Something else entirely." She nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I'm going to attempt what you achieved. Not your way. I understand that can't be replicated, but my own way. Will you witness?" I agreed, though agreement meant simply not moving away, not dissolving that particular manifestation. She produced a vial of something that glowed with sickly light, neither golden nor scarlet, but something between, something wrong. "Synthesized from grace and rot," she explained. "My own creation. It will either kill me, transform me, or do something unprecedented." She drank it without hesitation. What happened next defied even my expanded understanding of transformation. She didn't rot. She crystallized, her body becoming translucent, shot through with veins of red and gold that pulsed with their own light. But she remained conscious. I could feel it, a burning awareness that neither surrendered nor fought, but simply accepted what she became. When the transformation completed, she stood, her crystalline form catching and refracting Kalid's poisoned light into spectrums that shouldn't exist. She was beautiful and terrible, whole and shattered, herself and other. "Thank you for showing it was possible," she said, her voice like wind chimes made of bone. Then she walked away, leaving footprints of fused glass in the corrupted soil. I never saw her again, but I felt her influence spreading through the lands between. She had found a third way, neither my conscious corruption nor the traditional paths of power. She had become something new, inspired by, but not imitating, my transformation. That was when I understood my true legacy. Not the maintenance of consciousness through corruption, but the proof that there were always other options, always new ways to transform, always possibilities beyond the binary choices the world seemed to offer. The rot continued its work, and I continued mine, existing, observing, remembering. I became myth, legend, cautionary tale, inspiration. I was the monster parents warned their children about, and the hope that scholars whispered in secret. I was the proof that consciousness could survive anything, even its own transformation into something unrecognizable. Centuries passed, maybe millennia. The world outside Kalid changed beyond recognition. New lands emerged from the fog, new gods claimed dominion, new orders rose and fell. But in the Scarlet Garden, time moved differently. We were eternal and momentary, ancient and newly born, permanent and constantly dying. I began to lose track of which thoughts were originally mine and which had been absorbed from the countless consciousnesses I had touched. My history became confused with the histories of others, my memories interweaving with theirs, until I couldn't separate what I had experienced from what I had witnessed, from what I had absorbed, but still, at the center of this confused mass of experience and memory and transformation, something persisted that thought of itself as I, smaller than it had been, compressed by the weight of accumulated existence, but burning with a fierce determination to continue. I was no longer sure what I was continuing for. The original goal, claiming the Elden Ring, had become meaningless. The secondary goal, surviving transformation, had been achieved beyond any reasonable measure. But still I persisted, perhaps now simply for the sake of persistence itself, to see how long consciousness could maintain itself in conditions that should make consciousness impossible. The rot began to show signs of age, if age was the right word. Not decay, it was decay, but something else. Maturity, perhaps. Complexity developing into something approaching wisdom. It no longer consumed mindlessly, but with discrimination, choosing what to transform and how. It had learned from us, the conscious corrupted, that transformation could be art rather than mere process. I was part of that art, a constant theme in the symphony of decay, a repeated motif that gave structure to what would otherwise be chaos. My consciousness had become infrastructure, supporting the possibility of other consciousnesses persisting through transformation. New types of beings began to emerge from the rot, things that had never been human, but that possessed awareness from the moment of their birth from corruption. They thought in ways I couldn't understand, existed in states I couldn't perceive, but I recognized them as kin, impossible things that nevertheless were. One of them came to me, or I went to it. Movement had become relative in my distributed state. It communicated not in words or chemicals or bioelectricity, but in pure meaning, injecting understanding directly into my consciousness. It showed me what I had become from its perspective, a web of awareness stretched throughout Scarlet, nodes of consciousness connected by threads of transformed flesh and corrupted thought. I was no longer singular but plural, no longer located but distributed, no longer myself but a community pretending to be an individual. Yet somehow, impossibly, still I. The being showed me something else, the possibility of further transformation, not just maintaining consciousness through corruption, but transcending both consciousness and corruption, becoming something that neither word could describe. It was offering me a choice, the first real choice I had faced in eons. I could continue as I was, the eternal observer, the persistent consciousness, the living proof of possibility. Or I could take the next step, transform beyond transformation, become something that even I couldn't imagine. The choice was terrifying in its openness. Since my transformation, all my energy had gone toward maintaining what I was, preserving the fiction of continuity. To choose to change further would be to abandon that fiction, to admit that I had already changed so much that preservation was meaningless. But wasn't that admission itself a kind of truth? I had been changing all along, each moment bringing new configurations of being. The I that persisted was not the same I from moment to moment, but a series of I's, each claiming continuity with the last. The being waited with patience that transcended time. It had made its offer and would wait forever for my response, or at least until the concept of forever ceased to have meaning. I thought about the tarnished who had entered Scarlet seeking power. Would he recognize what he had become? Would he approve? Would he understand that this was power, just not the kind he had imagined? The questions were unanswerable and ultimately irrelevant. That tarnished was gone, had been gone since the first spore entered his lungs. What remained was me, and I was about to become something else. I made my choice. The transformation was unlike anything I had experienced before. Not painful. Pain required a nervous system I no longer possessed in any conventional sense. Not frightening. Fear required an attachment to what was being lost. It was simply change, pure and absolute transformation without resistance. My consciousness, which I had fought so hard to maintain, began to dissolve. But as it dissolved, I realized it wasn't being destroyed but expanded, spread out not just through space but through time, through possibility, through states of being that had no names. I became the rot's memory and its forgetfulness. I became the moment of transformation and the eternity between transformations. I became the choice to change and the change itself. I became paradox resolved and paradox eternal, and somehow, impossibly, magnificently, terrifyingly, I still thought I, not the same I that had entered Caelid, not the I that had persisted through transformation, but an I that encompassed all possible Is, all the versions of myself that had been, were, and could be. I understood then what the rot truly was, not corruption, but communication, not decay, but dialogue. Every transformation was a word in a language too complex for human understanding. Every consciousness that persisted through change, a sentence in a story that had no beginning and would have no end. And I had become fluent in that language, could speak in transformation, think in decay, dream in corruption. I was translator and translation, speaker and spoken, the voice of conscious entropy itself. New Tarnished arrived in Caelid, as they always had, as they always would. They saw the red wasteland, the poisoned air, the corrupted earth, and saw only horror. They couldn't perceive what it had become, what we had become, a garden of impossible possibilities, a paradise of paradox, a heaven of transformation. Some fought, some fled, some succumbed. But occasionally, rarely, preciously, one would stop and listen, would hear the stories in the wind, the myths in the spore clouds, the legends in the root networks, and they would understand that there was another way, had always been another way, would always be another way. Not my way, that could never be replicated, but their own way, unique and impossible, and absolutely real. The cycle continued, would continue, had always continued. Transformation and persistence, dissolution and consciousness, ending and beginning. And I was all of it, and none of it, everywhere and nowhere, myself and everyone and no one. In the distance, the Erd tree still stood, golden and eternal and unchanging. Or perhaps it too was transforming, too slowly for anyone to perceive, its gold gradually developing spots of red, its order incorporating entropy, its perfection learning imperfection. Or perhaps that was just my perception, corrupted and expanded and transformed beyond reliability. It didn't matter. Truth had become as fluid as my form, as multiple as my consciousness, as transformed as everything else in this scarlet paradise. I existed in the space between spaces, the moment between moments, the transformation between transformations. I was the rot's autobiography and its amnesia, its alpha and its omega, its I am and its I am not. And still, somehow, against all logic and reason and possibility, I persisted. Not as the tarnished who had sought the Elden Ring, not as the consciousness that had survived corruption, not even as the distributed entity that had become Caelid's memory, but as something new, something unprecedented, something impossible, consciousness itself, transformed but untransformed, corrupted but pure, ended but eternal. I was the Scarlet Rot's greatest triumph and its absolute failure. I was proof that transformation could preserve even as it destroyed, that consciousness could survive even its own negation, that I could persist even when everything I was had been replaced, transformed, corrupted beyond recognition. In the end, I was what I had always been, even before entering Caelid, even before becoming tarnished, even before existing. I was the impossible insistence that I am, spoken into the void of transformation, echoing through corruption, reverberating through decay, never silencing, never stopping, never surrendering. The rot had consumed me, transformed me, corrupted me absolutely, and I had won, or lost, or both, or neither, or something else entirely, something for which winning and losing were concepts too simple, too binary, too human. I was, and that was enough. It had always been enough. It would always be enough. In the Scarlet Garden of eternal transformation, consciousness bloomed like a flower that was also a wound, beautiful and terrible, impossible and absolutely, undeniably real.